Welcome everyone. We are live and I'm here today with Amaury Séchet, who is the lead developer of Bitcoin ABC and the creator of Bitcoin Cash, more or less. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
It's wonderful to have you here, and I wanted to sort of talk about a bunch of different things. So this conversation first came up a few interviews ago when we were talking about Bitcoin Cash and rolling checkpoints. And there's a lot of controversy around that, and I thought it would be great to have you on to talk about that. But what's even more interesting is the story of Bitcoin Cash in general, how it was created, why it was created, and all of the context surrounding that. Because I think a lot of people, like, there's not too much documentation of that, and there's a lot of he said, she said. So it's always nice to have a lot of different perspectives out there from people who actually were involved and were there at the time, and not just kind of reporting from the periphery. So let's start off. Talk about like your involvement in Bitcoin Cash, and obviously you're lead developer, so sort of running the show of ABC right now. And how did you get involved in Bitcoin in the first place?
Oh, in Bitcoin in general. So I read about Bitcoin in an article in like 2010, late 2010, by some Belgian blogger called Plume. And he was talking about this new form of currency that, there was like no central bank or anything. And it was essentially like native on the internet. And I found it very interesting. This is something that was already in the back of my mind at the time, and a lot of people, right? Like the idea of having a currency that works natively on the internet, but it's a very difficult technical challenge to make that happen. And so when that happened, I was fairly interested. And then, especially like in 2011, 2012, it seems like it was growing a lot. So that was the realization to me that it was not like just me and a few other people that were interested in this, but there was the potential for that thing to become fairly big. And so at that point, I was pretty seriously into it. Even though I guess like a lot of smart people in the space, I don't really want it to have my face front and center, but that more or less happened with the start of Bitcoin Cash.
Absolutely. Like, I just wanted to stay on the periphery and not be that involved. And now you're right at the center of things, and at the center of controversy too. So, I mean, Bitcoin Cash is not without a tremendous amount of controversy that even continues now. And even recently with the fork, and I want to go into that a little bit later as well with the BSV, and your take on everything that went down there. I think that'll be interesting to go into. But let's start off with rolling checkpoints, just because that is something that I know a lot of people wanted me to cover. And before we do, a huge thank you to whoever sent through the power chat on Bitbacker. I really appreciate that. They sent through some Bitcoin Cash, and they said Mr. Satoshi is greater than Craig scam wrong. So there you go. I appreciate you sending through the power chat. But let's talk about the rolling checkpoints. So this is something that came about, and it's not very chronological of us to start here, but I think it's an important issue to cover. It came about because there was a recent split with BSV and with Craig Wright and N-Chain, and basically Craig Wright has just been threatening people left, right, and center, and threatening to destroy any chain that is not his, and to do all kinds of crazy things. And so Bitcoin ABC, you guys implemented this rolling checkpoint on the BCH on the chain. And this was to safeguard against 51% attack or a major reorganization of the block. So walk me through how this was decided, and what responses you have to some of the pushback that like 10 blocks is just way too small, and it's way too centralized, and all of this stuff that you hear.
Okay, so first, the name checkpoint is not very accurate. Like a checkpoint is something that developers put into the software saying, okay, this is like the Genesis block, for instance, is a checkpoint for Bitcoin. Like any software that runs Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash, or like any variation of Bitcoin is not gonna synchronize any chain that don't have the Genesis block. And what has been happening over the year is that the developer have been adding checkpoints in the software on the regular basis, usually many hundreds of blocks before the state of the chain when the software is ready. So this is what checkpoints are. Here, what we did is a bit different. It's what's going to happen is that if a node receive blocks, and if it has received the blocks for more than 2 hours and the block is more than 10 blocks deep into the chain, then the node is going to consider that block as final and not reorg past that. So we are not making as developers the decision of what that block is. Each individual node is making its decision based on what it sees of the blockchain. So this is not like a central authority by developers to decide what is the valid chain and what is not the valid chain. How it came about is that there were threat of 51% attack, and a lot of people came to us. They were worried about that, and they essentially asked us to develop a solution like that. So, as as a software developer, you get to do what the people that use your software wants you to do. People have this image. And maybe it's true in some currencies that you are the developer and you're gonna impose whatever you want, but I don't think this is how you become successful on any market doing anything. Like, this has nothing to do with cryptocurrency specifically. They are just like, we're making software, and there are people that use our software. There are miners and exchanges and payment processors and this kind of people. And when they're worried about something, you need to provide solution to them, or you will be replaced on the market. That's how it works.
Point. Yeah. So, I mean, what do you say to people who say that this makes a reorganization easier because all someone who wants to threaten the chain would have to do is basically amalgamate 10 blocks in succession? I mean, you would have a much better understanding of how it works than I do. But I have heard concerns like that it's actually it weakens the security of the chain. So, what's your response to that?
So it's definitely a trade-off. It makes some kind of attack more difficult, and it makes some other kind of attack easier. So this is why this wasn't in place previously. But it seems that the people we're talking with, they're more worried about the kind of attack that this protects against, and less worried about the kind of attack that it helps with. So this is why we went into that direction. Now, there is no, it's always, engineering is always a matter of trade-off. So the trade-off that you make here is that it's become essentially impossible to do a reorg that is very deep, right? So if you come like, surprise, I have like 50 blocks on some other branch of the blockchain, and everybody's gonna reorg there, but you cannot do that anymore. But what you can do is essentially like grow two chain roughly at the same speed. If you have a fair amount of hash rate, you can help one side or the other, so that both grow roughly at the same speed. And then in that situation, people are gonna have to manually switch to one of the two chain, or there is a risk that part of the network goes its own way on some other branch of the chain. But because of the timing involved, it's not that easy to pull off. It's definitely possible, but it's fairly easy to make sure, considering like the blocks, they take a few seconds to propagate on the network. So you need to be able to produce 10 blocks on two branches within a few seconds of each other. Considering the difficulty is such as it takes 10 minutes to produce a block, so it's not that easy to pull off in practice. But this is definitely like this is definitely where the risk is a bit increased for this kind of scenario.
Yeah, for sure. So now, seeing as we're on that train of thought, talking about BSV and the threats and the competition there, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the split and how the split with Craig Wright came about with N-Chain and the different directions that the two different camps wanted to take the tech in. Actually, it was three different camps, sort of all wanted something different, and let's talk about the actual eventual split and where we are now in the ecosystem. So when these discussions were first coming up, what was the major difference between ABC and N-Chain, for example, in terms of like what different things did both camps want?
Okay, so what we want is fairly simple. We want to build digital cash, right? So the whole goal of the project is to make a form of electronic cash that have both the property of what you expect from an electronic payment system, where payments are fast and cheap and can go anywhere in the world, but at the same time that has the property of hard money, because this is where we think that the major breakthrough happened, right? Before that, in the whole history of humanity, you had essentially to pick either soundness or convenience in your money, right? So you had stuff like precious metal that have very good scarcity properties. They are fungible and all of that. They have like many of the good property that make good money, but they are not very convenient to use on a day-to-day basis. And on the other hand, you have fiat money that is significantly more convenient to use, but that doesn't have the hard money property that precious metal can have. And those two have been the most popular form of money during whole human history. And you see an endless cycle between one and the two, because what's happening is that there is not that much trust in the society. So people are going to use precious metal. But then as the economy grow of whatever civilization, it becomes too inefficient, and there are too many people involved in the economy, so they need more efficient form of money, and they start using some form of fiat money, and it lasts for a while, for the time where the overall society has a high degree of trust, and people don't abuse the weakness that fiat money can have. But eventually, one day or another, someone inflate the money supply like crazy, and the whole stuff collapse, and then you get a few years of civilizational collapse, and slowly people rebuild using our money, and you get that cycle. Like like this is applicable to almost every. Yeah. Well, it's not that they never learn. It's that
they're actually invested in the process, and they actually want to do this because it tremendously helps their war efforts.
Yeah, and we had
a lot of things.
We had nothing better for all of history, right? Like we had no technology that both had hard money property and that was very convenient and scalable.
And I would say that was mainly because the government had a monopoly on the money supply, and actually most countries made it illegal for any sort of competing currency. So how are you meant to innovate when you have someone with a stranglehold who isn't required to innovate, who isn't at the behest of consumer demand?
Sure, but even if you remove all of that, what you say is true, but even if you remove that, we had no better technology anyway, right? Like you could trust the central bank or whoever is in charge, but maybe if we had private competing money, we had many people that are more trustworthy than the central bank be in charge of some money somewhere. But you still would have to trust that person to not screw it up.
That's true.
And eventually, like, people screw up constantly, right? So even if the person is like very good and very trustworthy and everything, one day or another, that person is gonna screw up something, and you don't want that with your money.
Yeah. And there's always, I mean, when you have that focal point, there are always a leverage point. I mean, whether it's for government to shut them down, which we saw many times in the past, or whether it's just for people who want their interests to be carried out. Gosh, it's so windy here. Can you hear that wind? It's insane.
A little, but not too much.
When you have any sort of leverage point and people who think that they can take advantage of that, I mean, it becomes a very dangerous situation to have centralized things where people can be corrupted. So let's talk about like what did Bitcoin ABC want that BSV didn't? Like why did they come into conflict there?
So what we consider to be important as those monetary properties, we welcome any kind of technology that improve those monetary properties. Whereas BSV is more of a fundamentalist coin, I'd say, in the sense that this is how it was written in day one, and this is how it shall be forever, right?
Yeah. according to the gospel of Satoshi.
Exactly. Well, not even that much. So they do what every good religion does. They don't claim themselves to be like the gospel of a Satoshi, but if you watch what they write, they say this is how it was intended to be. Right? And this is good because Satoshi is not around to say what his intentions were anymore. And so you can essentially twist whatever he says to say, oh, he meant to say this or that or whatever, and then you do that, and you are doing the word of Satoshi, right? So they are pulling the good old trick that has existed for thousands of years.
Well, they're putting a little bit of a twist on that trick, because they can then say like, well, I am Satoshi, and no, I'm not going to prove it to you, even though it would be very simple for me to do so. I just want you to take my word for it, and this is what I want from the chain. This is my
yeah. So yeah. There is a lot of that as well. But yeah, I find it quite interesting from a sociological perspective. Like there is very interesting group dynamic going on there.
Have you ever read?
Because like people don't quite realize, but Bitcoins in the early days, it was crap. Like you got to realize that, like the first implementation, and Satoshi himself was very clear about this, or you can ask Gavin Andresen, I think, had a comment saying that at the beginning, like it did not even work, right? There were so many bugs that were technology breaking in the original version of the software. For instance, you couldn't spend any coin putting up true up return as instead of a signature in your transaction. So anyone could claim any coin that exists anywhere without providing a signature. There was like a ton of bugs similar to that were completely breaking. Mm-hmm. So and all the people that were there in the early days, including Satoshi or Alfine or people like Gavin Andresen or whatever, if you like some of them you cannot ask them because they're not around anymore, but even they were saying it at the time, and the ones that are still around today, they're gonna confirm that to you. Yeah. But because it was 10 years ago, we start to forget. But that creates a situation where you cannot say, okay, we're gonna revert back everything like it was in day one, because in day one there was a technology that did not quite work. So now you have to create that stuff where you're not creating stuff like they were at day one because everything was broken. So now you need to claim that you are creating something that was like intended, like Satoshi intended them to be when he created the stuff at day one, but he couldn't quite make it that way because it was small and there was not that many people involved. But no, we can like do exactly what he intended us to build, which is very strange, and it's more of a cult than a technology project at this point. when you are going in that direction, it's definitively like it's very similar to Christians that are gonna try to interpret the word of Jesus when Jesus is not there anymore, because right. It's not been around for 2,000 years now. So nobody can go ask Jesus, like, what do you say, whatever, to the Roman or whatever, like, what did you mean then, And so, mm-hmm. So now you have like all those people that say, okay, this is actually what the lesson of that story is, and then those are people that say something else. I don't think this is very interesting game to play.
Yeah, and a lot of people say, I mean, they talk about the tech of BSV and just say like it's they haven't done all of the testing that the other chains were doing. They were coming out with these pronouncements of what they wanted that were kind of, I mean, not going to create a workable chain mm-hmm. is the idea, and yet no one seemed to be paying attention to that. They didn't almost weren't looking at the technical aspects of any of this. They were just looking at, as you said, this kind of cult. They're just part of this sort of cult following. Like, did you and Craig ever, like, were you ever particularly close? And if so, did you ever have like a falling out?
No, we were never close.
Yeah. So it always baffled me that Bitcoin Cash sort of brought Craig into the midst and let him run havoc there.
I saw it happening. That was never something I was really happy with, but you cannot I mean, like there is a whole community. If enough people are gonna get this guy around, you're just gonna alienate everybody. And so there was not very much I could do at the time.
It almost seemed like and we'll talk about that in a second, the history of how Bitcoin Cash came about, the original fork there, and all of the censorship that there was going on. And I mean, it really was this kind of vicious time. I remember there's so much debate going on. And it almost seems like with Craig coming along, he kind of became, people sort of saw him as like this useful idiot that maybe they could use to their benefit. Like if people are following him and he's on our side, maybe we could use that to our advantage and leverage that and help, get support for this thing we're creating. But then it sort of turned, the tables turned somewhere in there, and he just became this person. Like, I mean, I disagree with the premise to begin with. Like, I don't think you should ever involve someone like that who clearly, like, I mean, he just seems so fraudulent in so many ways. Like, you never want something like that.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like people tell you, oh, you have no proof that he's not Satoshi. No, but we have a fair bit of proof that he's a fraudster, and maybe it's Satoshi, but even if he's Satoshi, he's a fraudster. There is no way to get around that one.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like they say that, if Craig Wright ends up being Satoshi, it's not going to change my opinion of Craig Wright. It's going to change my opinion of Satoshi. Like, I mean, you can't just say, oh, well, he's Satoshi, therefore we have to listen to him. It's like, well, even if he was, which he clearly isn't, but even if he was, then, that would mean that that Satoshi is a fraudster. So why would you want to follow someone like that anyway?
Yes, exactly.
Like, it doesn't make much sense. So right now, I mean, there's this big split in Bitcoin Cash, which I thought was very, very sad to see, because I did like that Bitcoin Cash was sort of the stronghold that did provide great competition to the market. And I think it still does, but it seems to be going through some tough time at the moment. And, how's everything going, especially with Bitmain? I mean, they fire half their workforce. They stopped working on Wormhole. They stopped, there have been a lot of cutbacks that have had to happen there. So what do you see in the future, and what's going on there? Like, I know that I also chatted to Chris Pacey recently about Avalanche, which seems really interesting, and that's again very controversial as well. But what's your take on the situation at the moment?
So what's happening to Bitmain is happening to a lot of company actually, but Bitmain being like, this giant crypto company, it's probably more visible there, and it has more effect when they do. It's more or less this. So this is tied to something I've been saying like for a year at least of what's happening in the market. But if people are familiar with the supply and demand graph, where you have like quantity on one side and price on like quantity on one axis and price on the other axis, and then you have like two curves for the supply and the demand, and they cross somewhere. And that gives you like the quantity produced and the price for some good on the market. I don't know if you're familiar to that. This is like usually what you see in the first economic class you take. And this is what we call the market equilibrium. Well, the crypto market is very strange because the slope of the supply curve is the wrong way around. So what do I mean by that? What that means is you have people like miners and also like exchanges or whatever. You have many companies that work in the crypto space and that have income that depends on how big crypto is essentially, right? But those companies, they are gonna pay salary and rent and electricity bills and all of that, and they are gonna have to sell some of their crypto to do so. And what's happening is that the more the price of crypto goes down, the more they have to sell to pay all of this. And vice versa, the higher the price of crypto is, and the less they need to sell. And so you find yourself in this kind of strange market that is very uncommon, where when the price go down, suddenly people start selling more, which causes even more downward pressure, which causes people to sell more. And
that sets up a bunch of limit orders as well, and then the price goes down even further, and then
you have the same. You have the same the other way around. Like the price goes up, and as a result, people don't need to sell as much to pay whatever they need to pay, and you get those huge ramp up and then those huge crashes, and it comes about because of that. So now that we established, like, you have this cycle that causes the price to go down, and when does the price stop going down? Well, when the amount of obligation, so the the salary or the electricity bill, the rent, all of that those companies have to pay goes down, right? This is the only way this is gonna stop the downward spiral. And that happened in two ways, right? Either big company in the space downsize or they go bankrupt, right? And when enough of them either downsize or go bankrupt, then you find a new equilibrium and you can get into the next phase of the cycle where things start to recover.
It's sort of this nice time in a way that kind of gets rid of a lot of the fluff. And when you're saying like they have to downsize to the bare bones of what they're doing, like I think it's very easy to get lost in this space. You're suddenly flush with cash, and what are you doing? You create all the this is feature creep, and there's all this stuff that happens. And you forget what does the market actually want? Why is crypto around? What's the point of it all? And when stuff like this happens, and you get back down to the basics, you kind of get back to those fundamentals.
Yes, so it's very rough when you go through it, and it's very scary. And I understand this is the first time for many people in the space, but this is not the first time that happened. Actually, in some way, it felt like 2014 was a more rough. Like I think you were already in the space at the time.
Yeah.
You had like news of people committing suicide on a regular basis, and it was very, very bad. So in many ways, it's pretty bad, but it's better than previous cycles.
We're having far fewer suicides, so that's a plus.
Yeah.
It's just so dark.
Well, this is where the baseline is. Like, this is what happened the previous time. So
suicide metric. This is just, oh my God. All right. So I mean, you're right. Like and when you look at the amount that the market has downturned, it's not even as large a percentage as we've seen in the past.
I don't know. Actually, I think it's one of it's bigger. I think it's bigger in terms of price than last time.
I think that because aren't they throwing around numbers like 85%, but before we've seen 88, 92%. I mean,
but that was that was like in 2011 or this time around when the price when the price go from $30 to like $1 or whatever. There was like one of those crash at the time.
Yeah,
but it's different because at the time there was like no real business. There was not many people operating in crypto. Whereas in 2014 and this time around, there is actually a lot of business and a lot of people whose livelihood, revolve around crypto. So there's a
lot more to lose.
There is a much more dire personal consequences for many people.
Yeah, that's for sure. And a lot of the people entering the space who didn't get in when it was like a penny, and if they lose $1 million worth of something that they only bought $10 worth of in the first place, then it doesn't seem as big of a loss. But if you got in 2017 and you built a company because you were like, this is only ever going up, and suddenly you have 2000.
No, I told a lot of people at the time that it was no good to get in.
Yeah, absolutely. When I started getting advice from like everyone that I'd ever met about every coin they're investing in, and I just had a moment of, this is not going to end well for any of these people. This is, unless they have the longevity, if they can stay in the space and get out of some of the shitty things they're involved with and kind of, consolidate maybe, but it doesn't look good. So, I mean, a lot of people are talking about the split with BSV and just like the community and how they wish that there could be some way that we could bring camps back together. Obviously, they're going in very different directions at this stage. And I think that getting involved with something where the figurehead is a fraudster is not that appealing to a lot of people, regardless of the tech. But what is your take on the tech? And do you ever see the potential? Like, let's say that Craig wasn't even involved in any of this. Do you see any sort of potential for like consolidation there?
Not really, because the tech don't make a lot of sense. So what they've done is that they've increased the block size to 128 meg, but we know for a fact that the software don't work very well. Like 32 meg, like we're right now, is really pushing the envelope of what the software can deliver. So you can change that limit. It's not very difficult, right? It's like a local government could decide that you can go to 300 miles an hour on every road and change all the signs, right? But that wouldn't mean that the car that drive on those roads could do it, and it would be secure to do that. It's like changing the block size is the least interesting part of solving that problem of scaling the blockchain. The block size is just there so that you don't go in the territory where things start to not work at all. And so when you remove that limit, you don't suddenly change everything so that it stops working. And you can see that very clearly because they produced many very large blocks, and they all took an absurd amount of time to propagate themselves. So I don't know the timing for the very last one, but shortly after the force, they produced a 64 megabyte block, and it took more than half an hour to propagate itself over the network. So you can imagine that if that was the throughput of the system, there was enough transaction on that system going on so that blocks were 64 meg. What would be happening is that miner would collect those transactions, create a 64 meg block, and send it on the network. But because it takes half an hour to propagate itself across the nodes, during that meantime, on average, you could have 3 other miners finding a block, right? So after half an hour, have 4 tips of the chain. And you're going to reconciliate those tips of the chain by finding more blocks on top of them. But what's going to happen is because those blocks take themselves also half an hour to propagate, like quickly you have like 16 tip of the chain and so on, right? So you essentially do 4x on the amount of branch that you have on average every 10 minutes. So the whole stuff just don't work anymore. You don't converge toward a new chain anymore. And if you run the math essentially and intuitively you can understand it if you understand that phenomena is that you want the time you need to propagate and validate a block to be very small compared to the block time. Because when that's not the case, first you start having economic incentive that becomes a bit perverse for miners. And then when it gets more than the block time, nothing works anymore. So this is the problem you need to solve. If you want to scale the blockchain, this is the problem you want to solve. Changing the block size is then just changing a number in the software. It's not very difficult nor very interesting.
Yeah, it seems like there are a lot of technical hang-ups there that people like to brush over when they sort of tout the achievements of BSV and not realizing that these are kind of just publicity stunts that are not really helpful.
Yeah,
and
those are absolutely
really
PR stunts. Yeah.
And so, I mean, let's talk a little bit, because I don't want to stay on the BSV side too much. So it just seems like this very litigious, patent trolling, like toxic culture that I'm not a big fan of. I tried to look into the tech, like from what I can tell from chatting to people like yourself, Chris Pacio, who's on my show quite often, a lot of other lead developers of other projects that I interview. It just doesn't seem particularly robust. And I mean, what do you predict that is going to happen there? Like, is this going to be propped up? It seems that it's been propped up quite a lot so far. Like, what do you think is going to be the outcome?
I think what's going to happen is that you're going to have the community becomes more and more belligerent and make more and more crazy claims to keep his share of attention.
I am Jesus.
Yeah. I am the reincarnation of Cleopatra.
I am the reincarnation. Who knows what? It seems like every time he loses the spotlight, he comes out with something else that you just kind of shake your head.
Yeah,
like there's the FTC, letter he wrote the other day.
Exactly. Yes. So Craig is doing that, but the community at large is doing that as well. Like there is this shark pool stuff, for instance. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
It's
what's your take on all the shark pool stuff?
Yeah, so it's a mining pool that they put in place, and essentially they're gonna mine pretty much any coin, but mine only empty blocks, and resell the miner rewards for BSV.
I see.
So this is like a very belligerent and very. This is a culture that is geared toward destruction rather than creation. And so there is not a lot of victory condition there, but this is it gets attention, and then from attention, then people get looped in it. But the problem when you play that game is that you need to make stuff that are more and more and more outrageous for you to grab the spotlight, because if you stay constant in how outrageous you are, then people get tired of it. So you need to crank up the volume every once in a while, and it's going to become more and more difficult.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the original fork. So when Bitcoin Cash was first created, and obviously that largely stems from you, but let's talk about the context of what was happening at the time. So there were these different agreements that were taking place, a lot of backlash because these backdoor agreements, no one really liked these things, but then they were trying to find basically a compromise between community, miners. There were all these different interplaying pieces that people were trying to work out. One side really wanted SegWit to be implemented, the other side wanted an increase in block size, and eventually there was this new agreement that came out that was the SegWit 2x agreement, and that seemed like it was going, like there was, obviously a lot of pushback in the community, but everyone sort of committed. There were a lot of businesses who signed on and said, we will sign this. A lot of miners started signaling that they were supporting SegWit. So it did seem like this was moving along. Somewhere along the line that got derailed. And I believe it was Jihan and yourself basically started coding up this alternative in case this thing didn't go through. Am I getting the story right so far?
Yeah, so there is a bit more to it, but I think there is a point that is overlooked by a lot of people, but that is the point that myself, decided me to start working on what would eventually become Bitcoin Cash. It's look at that from this perspective. You have SegWit 2x, and it's supported by like Coinbase, BitPay, Bitcoin.com, Bitmain, like whoever you can think of. Almost everybody is behind it. The sheer amount of power and resources in the space that is behind that project is absolutely huge. And then you have this small group of people that is very loud but not very large, that goes against it, and they end up winning. And that should give a pause to everybody, because when that happened, it means that someone didn't really understand what was going on at the time. And so what I said, that the reading I had of it at the time is that on one side, so there are essentially two factors that get there are two factors. One of them is that one side did not invest in infrastructure that much, and so if we want to talk, in libertarian space, there is always that question of who will build the road that keep coming up, and the truth is the people that actually build the road end up with a fair amount of power, and so what happened is that in that virtual space, there are virtual road, if you wish, and those are the software that propagate transaction and validate and allow mining, and I call this all this base layer of software that keeps everything running, right? And if you don't invest in that infrastructure, I think this is a pretty bad mistake, because you end up essentially having to go along with whoever does, because otherwise you have no infrastructure. And so I think that was one of the mistakes that was made. Like when you see the other camp, they were investing in infrastructure very, very seriously. So that's one thing that happened. And the second thing that happened is that they were playing a different game in the negotiation. So one side wanted to find a compromise, and almost everybody was good with the compromise, except a minority that was extremely uncompromising. They were not here to compromise. And you need to be willing to lose that small minority to make the compromise work. Because if like there is no compromise that you can find with that minority that's going to make them happy, except doing 100% of what they want. And so if you are not willing to lose that minority, you lose every single time, no matter how much resources you bring to that fight. Right? So and this is what I saw happening in Segwit 2x. So maybe 2-3 months before the fork point, they decided to change the activation mechanism of Segwit 2x to accommodate UASF. And so what would happen is that the USF node would not be forked off the network. Previously, they would have on August 1. So maybe I'm gonna explain what USF is, because it was like 2 years ago. Maybe people probably don't know. So USF
Ancient
was essentially
history in blockchain time.
So there was a group of people that decided to run a modified version of the Bitcoin Core node software that would activate Segwit August 1st, no matter what. Right? And they would fork themselves off if the majority does not activate Segwit. This was what this movement was about. And the Segwit 2x would have forked those people off until they changed the way they activate Segwit 2x, so that it activates in a way that is compatible with the way USF was activating it, which would ensure that all the USF people would stay on the chain after the Segwit activation. And then I think it was 2 or 3 months after, there was the block size increase. But what happened when you do that? What happened when you don't do that? What happened when you don't do that? The USF people, they fork on their own chain on August 1. Almost nobody followed them there, because they end up not having any payment processor or exchange support or whatever, because or miners, because everybody was supporting the alternative, right? So they would have created a minority chain, and maybe they're happy with that and they want to use that. I see like no big problem with that. But if you change things so that they stay on the chain, then after Segwit activate, they can claim this huge victory that thanks to USF, Segwit is activated, and now they have increased their position. They have more leverage in that negotiation, right? And 2 months or 3 months after, you want to do the part of the agreement that they disagree with. So if you do that and you give them, like, essentially you give them like all the chip in the negotiation 2 months before you want to do what they don't want, and they are really uncompromising to begin with. So you play that game, that, or probably, I think the people playing that game, they didn't know what game they were playing, right? And they were bound to lose because of that. So I saw that happening, and as a result, I was like, okay, this block size increase after Segwit activate is very unlikely to happen because of the way they are handling USF. So I essentially dropped what I was doing. At the time, I was working on extension block, which was a proposal that never happened. So maybe we don't need to dwell on that too much. But I was working on extension block. But roughly 2 months after August 1st, I was like, this Segwit 2x is not moving in the right direction. Because of the game theory around it, it's probably not going to work the way people expect it to work. So something else needs to happen. And I started working on Bitcoin Cash at the time. And I contacted various miners and various businesses around that. So a lot of people that were more on the big block size, they were very supportive, but still more supportive of Segwit 2x, if that makes sense. Like people like Roger was very happy that it was happening, but at the time, most of the resources of his company was behind Segwit 2x.
Well, he didn't really come on board with Bitcoin Cash until several months after the launch, right?
Like 2-3 months after, when Segwit 2x was canceled, essentially. Before that, it was supportive, but it was not, it was, just that. But then people like Hypoyoung from BTC, for instance, was very, very supportive. And so his mining pool started mining it right away. And he also managed an exchange. And the exchange listed BCH right away. And then we got like more exchange listing and more miners, and it snowballed from there.
So talk me through, so what actually happened? Why did you end up deciding to release the code? Because I know that this was being coded up in the background, but there was still hope that this proposal would go through. Or did you completely lose hope and you just decided on your own, I'm just going to
Well, on my side,
this
you
thing?
know, you can never read the future 100%, but because of the dynamic that was going on in the negotiation, I was convinced that Segwit 2x would fail with very high likelihood.
Okay. And this was, I mean, the dynamic that was happening at the time, it was very much like an anti-business rhetoric that was talking about like those who were in opposition to the 2x part of it. It was sort of like, oh, well, these are just people who want bigger blocks because they run businesses and, you know, down with them. Like I did notice that sentiment. Like, can you talk about the context at the time and the different points of view in this debate?
No, I think you got it right. There was a lot of people who. So first, maybe let's talk about the legitimate arguments that were going on, and those are essentially what I was talking with BSV. So when you make the block bigger, they take longer to propagate on the network. It degrades the incentives that goes on with mining in favor of bigger pools. And so if you grow the block size in a manner that is completely uncontrolled and unrestrained, you may end up collapsing the system into, you know, a very inefficient version of PayPal, where you have one miner that essentially processes everything in a way that is significantly less efficient than PayPal could do it. So that's bad. And people on the more small block size made all the technical argument on that front, and they are correct to an extent. Where they were a bit, you know, where they were incorrect is not in qualitative manner. Those arguments are true, but the number involved are such as those problems become serious much after 1 megabyte, and there are things we can do to, you know, push those limits even further.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there is a quantitative argument here that was maybe not right, but the qualitative argument was correct. Mm-hmm. But then you effectively add this maybe a bit anti-business movement where you know, we have those business on our chain and maybe they are too powerful or whatever, they control everything, and we want to you know, tell them to fuck off essentially, and tell them that we are the boss and control everything. That was a very strange rhetoric, because this is a self-defeating direction, you know.
Yeah.
If you start rejecting the people that are successful on your chain, then the logical end result is that you have nobody successful on your chain. So this you know, this created a degenerating social environment.
So when we're talking about the like the rhetoric and everything going on there, I mean, it started long before even this Segwit 2x debate. It started long before all of this. So it started really when, I mean, with Gavin Andresen, you know, and the GitHub, and then him like stepping away and then losing access entirely, and then going off to start his own coin with some people who like didn't agree with the direction that those in control at the time were going in. And so, you know, and then you had all this censorship around like Bitcoin Classic and any other attempt to create something different. And that's when the rhetoric around like only one can succeed, like one ring to rule them all, sort of started. And it just, from there, I mean, it really just kind of built momentum into this very toxic environment that kind of it permeates a bunch of different sectors in blockchain now. It's not just the Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash. It's like Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin SV versus, you know, anything else in the system. Yeah. Like it's. I mean, do you think like?
Sorry, what's happening is that it's a strategy that works, right? So in terms of strategy, if you are unwilling to retaliate when someone go after you, you end up gonna lose every single time, no matter how good you are in other aspect of whatever you're doing, right? So if you want to win a game, whatever that game is, so if I want to win the game of being a software developer, right, I need to learn about software and like computer science, the structure, whatever, right? And I need to practice on a regular basis to become good at it, and then I can become a software developer. But I also need to not lose, meaning that I need probably to eat and to sleep enough, and to maybe have a bit of exercise to stay healthy and stuff like that, right? Because if I don't do those things, I'm gonna die, or I'm gonna be in bad shape or whatever. And so even though those are not tasks that help me win the game per se, I can do those tasks all I want. I will never win the game, but those are tasks that I need to be doing to not lose the game. And so if you bring that understanding to what's going on in crypto, right now you have two family of pattern to think about this kind of thing. You have the maximalists. They are like, my coin is the true coin and everything else is the scam, and I'm gonna be hostile against everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And you have another group of people that is like, everything is welcome, it's all good, competition, whoever does the best is gonna attract more user and win at the end. And so when you look at it, the second option is much better at winning, but it's much worse at not losing.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. And as a result, when as a result, it's very bad against the first strategy. It's very bad against maximalism, because the maximalism are going to be willing to attack the non-maximalists, but the non-maximalists do not reciprocate.
Yeah, becomes a very one-sided battle, and we've seen
exactly that ends up being a one-sided
everywhere.
battle. Exactly, and this is why maximalist is so successful. And it's quite funny, because this is actually a question that is very well studied in game theory. Mm-hmm. And we know from game theory that the optimal behavior is none of those. The optimal behavior is to optimistically be cooperative, but ruthlessly retaliate to anyone who's hostile to you. Right. So what the big group should be doing if they want to win is cooperate among each other, but be willing to crush the maximalists. Because if they are not, the maximalists win every time.
I mean, it kind of is like this a reflection for society at large, it seems, like with different economic theories that are competing mm-hmm. as well. Because on the one hand, you have a group of people that say, listen, we couldn't even ever know. We don't have enough information. There are lots of unintended consequences that happen when you essentially plan things. So, we like, yes, this could be right. What we believe in is the ability for someone to choose this if they want to do this of their own volition. And then on the other side, you have people say, like, this is correct, we're going to plan this, we're going to control it, and so it becomes a very one-sided battle, with one side not really retaliating because they're saying, like, listen, no one really knows, that's the point, like, we don't have the information. The other side saying, those guys are idiots, they don't even know, like,
this is a very common this is a very common mistake that more liberty-minded people that want to do whatever are making. Mm-hmm. Where they're like, okay, if you want to do this is fine, right? But the limit is that you should never ever get hostile toward me. That is more liberty-minded, and quite often the liberty-minded people, they have trouble making that step that they need to retaliate. Like if someone is either being hostile or even like threatening or whatever, you need to put a stop to that, like right now. Because if you don't, it's only gonna get bigger.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's very interesting, like watching the dynamics. I've been interviewing a lot of people for a lot of years now on these different topics, and it's fascinating for me to watch new people enter the space. And even there are people who've been in the space for years who get caught in this trap, right? They look around and they see the most vocal people, and then they're part of the club, and they say, "Oh, well, I'm part of this club of these vocal people, and anyone who disagrees with us is an idiot." And when you're actually talking to the builders behind the scenes, the people who are creating amazing things, who are developing new technologies, and you ask their opinions about some of the things that happens during the splits, people are a lot more rational than you realize, and a lot more open-minded. And I don't think I've ever talked to someone in person who I have tremendous respect for and built a company, who wasn't like, oh yeah, I like this, but I like this one too. Like, everyone is just this very open-minded, but it's the very vocal people on Twitter, for example, that come down hard, saying like, only ever BTC, this is the future, 100%. It's very
So the way we beat that is by being less naive about our approach, because the approach that most of the people that are not maximalist have is actually a losing approach against the strategy of maximalist, if you think about it in a strategy game kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Because the strategy that the maximalists have is not very good at winning, but it's very good at beating the other group. And so once you've beaten the other group, you're the only one playing. So it's just a matter of time before you win, and it doesn't really matter if you are very good at winning or not.
Yeah, it does seem like it's one side is much better at this strategy than the other.
Yes, yeah, and this is I think why it's spreading so much. It's it's just like pure Darwinism. It works, it reproduces itself, and as long as it keeps working, it's gonna reproduce itself more and more.
Yeah, for sure. And if we looked at, we looked at the history of Bitcoin as well, and you can frame it in terms of all kinds of different narratives. Obviously, on the BTC side at the moment, there's a lot of hype surrounding Lightning Network and the Lightning torch that was passed around, and it became this big thing. And it's interesting, like that could never have happened without SegWit. That SegWit needed to be implemented for Lightning to be successful. So it almost seems like this very
malleability fix. You need a malleability fix.
Well, it just seems like this very well thought out strategy if you look at it in terms of that. If you frame history in terms of like where we are now, Lightning's becoming very popular. Everyone's saying this is the future. Really, it was this very carefully constructed history where these things all had to line up in order for us to get here, which is very interesting as well.
Well, I don't know. You have to have that, right? Like, you cannot build infrastructure without having a general idea of where you're going, right? So
absolutely.
If you were to build a road, you want to know where the shops are gonna be, where people are gonna live, where they're gonna work, this kind of stuff. Otherwise, you have no way you can build roads in a way that makes any sense, right?
What's your? No, I was just going to say, like, what's your take on Lightning and what's happening there?
So, well, it's a bit complex, but Lightning is very interesting technology, I'd say. I think it's going to work great for some use cases, but it doesn't seem to me to be like a general purpose scaling solution. Because for various reasons, like one of them is that you end up having a liquidity problem for any kind of payment that is not of very small value. And if you run the number, it's completely unsolvable. Think about it like the way Lightning works is that people open channel with each other and they put money in the channel. And you can imagine that like those two people have a wire between them with some beads. And the beads are the Bitcoin that are in that channel. And they can move the beads back and forth between them, but there's just like one wire and one amount of beads. And then you can chain those channels together to form what people call the Lightning Network. So say I want to send you a payment, but I don't have a channel open with you, but maybe I have a channel open with Chris, and you also have a channel open with Chris, right? So what happens is that I can send 1 Bitcoin to Chris through the channel we have open, and then Chris send 1 Bitcoin to you through that same channel not the same channel, through the channel that he has opened with you, right? And effectively, you have one more Bitcoin, I have one less Bitcoin, and Chris has the same amount of Bitcoin. So effectively, it's as if I paid 1 Bitcoin to you. But what's happening is that the Bitcoins that Chris has in his channels are now he has like less Bitcoin available in one channel and more Bitcoin available in another channel. And if you run the numbers of what you need to have logged in all the channels for any two people to pay themselves, maybe $100 a few times through the lifetime of the channel, you end up with numbers that are, in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in terms of value that need to be logged in those various channels. So on that front, it clearly doesn't scale, not for technical reason, but though there are some technical challenges as well, but mainly because of economic reason, like the amount of capital that you need to lock in there for it to be a general purpose scaling solution is completely absurd. And so I don't think it's going to be a general purpose scaling solution. But I think a lot of the opposition to it maybe in the BCH community or other community maybe is a bit misplaced.
Yeah.
I think people should be more willing to use it. I'm fairly confident that it's going to become very popular, but for some specific use case, not as a general purpose payment solution.
And I do wonder about like legalities around it. Although I try to ignore what government is doing at all times, keeps my sanity. They are encroaching more and more, especially in terms of like cracking down on payment processes, for example. Now, if opening a channel and all of that becomes this difficult process that the average person can't be expected to do themselves, like we're looking at widespread mass adoption of this, and it's all going to be happening on Lightning, then people are either going to have to get, a whole lot more technically proficient, or we're going to need service providers that open channels for people and do all this stuff. And once you have that, once you have people like there's kind of this custodianship of coins, there's like a whole lot. It gets very complicated very quickly. And I wonder if people who are setting up, like if they're providing the service for people as like a channel operator, and there are just like a few,
they can become a target then,
they become a target, but they can also be like maybe potentially censorship of what transactions actually get recorded. But furthermore, what if they're just a well-meaning person who wants to open this thing, but then suddenly the government decides that they're now considered a money transmitter? You've just introduced into the mix a whole bunch of hoops that they have to jump through, a whole bunch of costs associated with anyone who wants to register as a money transmitter, and suddenly you've just added a whole bunch more fees. Like the reason the PayPal and the reason, you look at Patreon. The reason that they charge 10% of everything that comes in, 5% is to cover their overhead. 5% is for them to outsource the payment processing. Now, if you've just added another 5% onto transactions in order to pay someone's overhead and compliance costs of them being considered a money transmitter, you've just basically reestablished all of the issues we have with traditional finance. So
maybe not all of them, but most of them, yes.
Right, and it just like I'm very optimistic by nature, and I really hope that it works out. But I do see a lot of issues at the start that I hope get solved, but there are a lot of question marks in my head.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I'm sure I have something to add.
So let's we are running out of time here, and I do want to briefly mention Avalanche, what's going on there. I did interview Chris Pacey recently at Liberty Forum about this. So in a nutshell, just describe Avalanche for anyone who doesn't know, and then maybe talk about why there's controversy surrounding it, why there's a lot of debate about this.
Okay, so Avalanche, the basic idea is that, let's set a bit of background to understand the problem that it solves. You have the system, and the system, like Bitcoin, is a system that have a certain state. So the state in Bitcoin is, I have that many Bitcoin, you have that many Bitcoin, like this, like who owns what, essentially. That is the state of the system right now. And this is the system that evolves over time. So you have a state transition. The academics voice it in that way. And what is a state transition? Well, we call that a transaction. A state transition is, for instance, I send 1 Bitcoin to you. And so now we have a new state where I have one less Bitcoin and you have one more Bitcoin, right? And you have a set of rules that define what is a valid state and what is a valid state transition. And those are what we call the consensus rules. So for instance, if I have just one Bitcoin, I cannot send 2 Bitcoin to you because I would be creating money out of thin air, right? So you have what we call the consensus layer with all the consensus rules that verify that you have a valid state and you have valid state transition between states. The problem is that it's not sufficient because you have this pesky double spend problem, right? Meaning I can do, if I have 1 Bitcoin, I can do a transaction that send 1 Bitcoin to you, and I can do the same transaction, well, not the same, a variation of that transaction that send the same Bitcoin to someone else. And those two state transitions are both valid, but obviously the two of them at the same time are not valid, right? And so we need to have a system that can decide which set of state transition we accept and which one we reject, even though they are valid. And the way we do that is by having a blockchain that accumulates more work. And we consider that whatever state transition exists in the chain that has the most work is the valid one, and the one that doesn't have the most work is not the most valid one. And this has various advantages, but one of the inconvenience of that is that it's very slow to converge to some decision making. And you inherently have a trade-off between how fast you want it to be and how scalable it is. Because if I decide that no, the block time is 1 minute, I need to be able to propagate my blocks 10 times faster to to scale in the same way. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I'm gonna reach a point where things start not working very well. So it was very clear to me very early on. Actually, I made a presentation about this in 2016, so way before Bitcoin Cash and all of that. I was like, if we want to improve the monetary property of Bitcoin, in terms both of zero conf and on scaling, we need to have the node cooperate with each other to decide as fast as possible what are the state transitions that we accept and what are the state transitions that we reject. So the transaction in the case of Bitcoin, so that their internal state essentially between nodes, they don't diverge too much as things goes on, right? So if I send you 1 Bitcoin and I send some other person 1 Bitcoin, then that other person may themselves respend the Bitcoin, or you can respend that Bitcoin to do something, right? And so you have a whole branch of possible future that are condition of one or the other being valid. And the more you wait before reconciliating that, the more work you have to do to reprocess all that subsequent history that happened after. So you want to do that as fast as possible, so everybody stay in sync as much as possible. And so when you have some synchronization event, like when you find a block that happened, the work that you need to do is minimal because you already agree on pretty much everything. So that's one aspect of it. And the second aspect of it is obviously it improves zero conf dramatically because immediately you make the decision right away when the process presents itself instead of waiting for blocks. And at the time we called that pre-consensus because those are operations you do before you enter in consensus with producing blocks and stuff like that. So that's kind of like a two-layered system where you have like one first system that makes some decision and a second system that essentially say you buy a house, you're gonna negotiate with someone, the previous owner, and you're essentially gonna come up with an agreement with the owner of when the house is transferred to you and for how much and all of that, right? But then you go through the whole notary process. That's gonna take much longer probably than the time you need to negotiate with the owner. But this notary process is useful in some way because it makes it clear to everybody that you actually own the house, right? Because before it's just like the people that were there and saw the negotiation happening can know what was the agreement, but everybody else doesn't know. And in the year or two, if there is a claim on that, maybe people don't quite know what happened anymore and who is right. So you have the notary process that goes on that write that officially somewhere that people can check, and if there is any kind of litigation later on. So the idea is to do kind of the same. When there is a new transaction, the node talk with each other and decide, like you would do with the owner of the house, like what transaction they want, what transaction they don't want. But you need to be participating in that process to know what the decision is. There is no record of what happened, right? So all the nodes that are there when it's happening and participate in that, they know. But if you were to connect next week, connect to the network, you would have no idea what the communication that went on between the node at the time were, right? So it doesn't quite replace the blockchain, but it's a way to get like an ephemeral decision before it's like, timestamp and in the blockchain and very hard to rewrite. And so at the time when I made that presentation, there was the reason I'm describing it in abstract term like that is because the avalanche technology did not exist at the time. And so we had various ideas on direction to move to achieve this kind of stuff. But I think about a year ago, there was this paper called Avalanche that came out that essentially solved that problem in a way that is more elegant than the solution that.
And this was an anonymous person who wrote this paper.
This was an anonymous person, yes.
Kind of just disappeared.
So they call themselves Team Rocket. I think it's very funny because, well, I don't know if you know, but in Pokemon, the hero in the Japanese version is called Satoshi, and the Team Rocket is the bad guy in the Pokemon anime. Anyway. So that's probably like, kind of a bit of a joke based on the name Satoshi. Anyway, they came up with that very elegant way to solve that problem. And so at this point, we essentially ditched the previous attempt to solve that problem that we were working on and decided that this was probably the way to make it happen. And so Avalanche is, exactly that. It's a technology that allows nodes to talk to each other and come to a common agreement on something, but there is no record on anything or whatever. So some people want to do a coin that works only on Avalanche. There's another project called AvaCoin that does that. It's a bit different because then, if you want to know the state of the world, you essentially need to rerun Avalanche with everybody since the Genesis block. And it's not very efficient. And it's not clear you would do that for SPV, for instance, and so everybody needs to run a node. Maybe they have a solution for that, but I'm not aware of one. There is all kind of complication if you want to do just Avalanche. But if you want to do Avalanche on like a 10-minute time scale between blocks and then use the blockchain, you get the very nice property of both systems. Right. So that's what it is. Why it's a bit controversial.
It seems that it almost becomes like this alternative to proof of work that happens, and maybe people. I mean, it seems like you're solving this smaller problem, which it seems very interesting. But it's actually much larger than that. It's much larger than just solving this niche problem. It seems like this could be a new way
it gets
of
to the
doing
root
everything.
of the problem, right? Like people see it as solving zero conf. That's probably like the thing that people are most interested in, but it actually solved a much deeper problem that not get very much out of sync in between blocks. And then when you find the blocks, they have a lot of work to do to get back in sync. So it has implication on scaling, it has implication on zero conf, it has implication on the security of the system as well, because it makes it more resistant against 51% attack, this kind of stuff. So it solved a problem that is a bit difficult to explain because it's quite abstract, but it has repercussion in many aspects of the coins that people care about, like fast confirmation, how much throughput you can have, how much secure it is, this kind of stuff. The reason why it's a bit controversial, well, it's quite simple to understand because it's a big change. It changed something that is very deep for what we think is the better, but every time you change something that is quite deep in the system, it's always a bit scary, right? Because what if we haven't thought that through very thoroughly? What if we get it wrong. We analyze the incentive of the system, and suddenly we screw up all the incentives, and things don't work. So there is a fair bit of concern. I think it's worth pursuing, regardless. There is no finalized spec of the proposal at this point in time. So I would invite people who have concerns to work them out, so we can make sure that we know what they are, and we can make sure that we don't make a mistake by finalizing any aspect of the spec, or even better, like propose some detail of the spec. Well, here is how we need to do that aspect of the spec so that it doesn't have the problem I'm worried about. That would be like the very best option. Yeah.
Right. So where's the best place for people to reach out if they do have like concerns that they want addressed?
I mean, like there are a bunch of chats everywhere where we are in. So there is like a ABC support. There is an Avalanche working group, if I'm not mistaken. If you go on the bitcoincash.org GitHub, there is a list of work groups in there that have different topics on different stuff that people are working on, and there is one for Avalanche. So actually, the work group for Avalanche is probably the best place to discuss that.
For sure. Well, I think we've run out of time. We've gone a lot over than what I was planning on doing, but there's so much to cover. I really appreciate your time. This has been really, really great. So yeah, thank you to whoever the anonymous person was who sent through the power chat. I really appreciate you guys who are tuning in via Bitbacker. That it does really help a tremendous deal. And everyone who's been in the chat today participating, there's been some really interesting things going on there. So I probably want to do more follow-up videos about all the topics that we've covered, but this has been really, really great. And thanks so much, Amaury, for your time. This has just been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Well, it's great. You're always so positive. That's the American way.
Well, I'm Australian.
The French way is like the complete opposite. It's like everything is bad. We complain about everything. Like this is nationalist part. I like that.
I think the American way is always like, everything's going to be fantastic.
Yeah.
And the Australian way is kind of like, oh, she'll be right. Not too worried. But no, I really appreciate your time. This has been really wonderful. So thanks to everyone who's tuned in, and I'll put some links to the different working groups in the information in the video, so everyone can check that out if they want to learn more about these things.
Okay, great.
Cool. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful
ciao.
rest of your day, everyone.